You couldn't describe Mark as a great publicist or PR person for Jesus and his message after reading today's gospel, could you? Great suffering, rejection, followed by death on the cross. Most of Jesus' ministry was in the Jewish area of Galilee and Judea. However, in the middle of Mark, we find Jesus and his disciples near Caesarea Philippi, a very Roman setting and once the limit of ancient Israel's northward extension. This was a capital built by Philip to honour the Roman emperor, who had given him this area to rule. It was famous for the temple to the pagan god Pan, the worship of Baal, the cult of emperor worship. The irony of Mark's gospel begins in a city built to celebrate worldly power. The stories leading up to this episode repeatedly emphasize the disciples' ignorance and hardness of heart. For the reader, however, Jesus' identity in the Gospel of Mark is never in doubt. The opening verse tells us that he is the Messiah and Son of God. We are privy to voices from heaven and declarations from demons, both of which declare Jesus' true identity as Messiah and Son of God. This rift between the reader's knowledge and that of the characters, particularly the disciples, is a significant narrative technique of Mark. It helps create irony and build tension. Up until chapter 8, the tension has been implicit. In this episode, it becomes explicit with Jesus' questions directly to the disciples. First, who do the people say I am? And then, who do you say I am? It introduces the idea that a prophetic ministry such as John the Baptist or Jesus will probably end with suffering and death. And as it turns out, this is exactly the direction of the narrative in chapter 8. Jesus accepts the Hebrew designation of Messiah, the chosen and anointed one, who fulfills the promise of David that God will establish David's throne forever. Here Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, the exalted figure from Daniel 7, who will come on the clouds of heaven to be given dominion over all. Jesus' question, who do people think I am, elicits a number of answers, all of them associating Jesus with the tradition of prophets whom God has appointed as speakers for his message to Israel. But who do you say I am? Peter answers with the right answer, but it's not very logical. The title Messiah in Hebrew, or Christ in Greek, was associated in Jewish tradition with an anointed king, a royal figure from the line of David, expected to come and free Israel from the Gentile oppressors, purify the people, and restore Israel's independence and glory. Nothing in Jesus' ministry to date had given any indication of claims to royalty or political ambition. So far, Jesus has made no claim to be the Messiah, and he certainly has shown no signs of taking on the Romans. Perhaps that's why Jesus tells his disciples not to tell anyone about him. Josephus, this historian, mentions a dozen or more Messiah figures being around Israel at this time. It therefore wasn't unusual to have claimants to the Messiahship. He then tells the disciples in stark, graphic detail what was meant for him to be the Messiah. He will undergo suffering, rejection, and death before he is finally vindicated by resurrection after 3 days. The rebuke from Peter to Jesus and then Jesus' stern reply is crucial to understand that Jesus is correcting some mistaken ideas the disciples have about messiahship. Jesus insists on identifying with the ostracized, unclean, and/or marginalized. He will allow himself to be judged and condemned as a blasphemer by the Jewish religious leaders. He will allow himself to be mocked, tortured, and executed as a criminal by the Romans. That is not all. Jesus expects his disciples to follow on this path of suffering and death. Jesus is talking about putting his priorities and purposes ahead of our own comfort and security. It means being willing to lose our lives by spending them for others, using our time, resources, gifts, and energy so that others might experience God's love made known to us through Jesus. Jesus asks, what good is it to gain the whole world but to forfeit our souls? What a challenge to the materialism which hardens our hearts against God and our fellow creatures. Environmental and climate activism requires sacrifices. We are called to sacrificial living, to live more simply. We will sacrifice our time, our resources, our energy. There may be times when we feel that we are burning out, but because challenges are so great, and yet we are called to act with hope. It is action that brings hope, and it is hope that inspires action. Before Home Ground opened, we planned and dreamt of a community. What would it be like? The needs to support the new community, our neighbours here next door. We employed a young man, Sam Morrison, as our community development lead, and he dreamed of a community with a garden that provided food and beauty. It was on the 9th floor of the building, and he was included in the Gardeners of the Year in 2003. Sadly, Sam passed in 2004, earlier this year, but his legacy has continued. I visit the Level 9 garden regularly, and it continues to give joy and nourishment. The Home Ground community continues Sam's dream and hope that the Home Ground community is one of hope in the spirit of renewal and recreation. Mark announces from the beginning that this story is good news. We need to read the whole story. Mark tells us that Jesus was faithful unto death, even while all around him proved faithless, and that God raised him to a new life. Because of this, we know that God's life-giving power is far stronger than the worst that human hands can do. Because of this, we know that there is no sin or failure so great that we cannot separate us from the love of God. Amen.